and to transform. One of the things that was happening to her with all of the stress was that she was losing her hair. This was at a time when most Americans didn't have indoor plumbing or electricity, the things that we take for granted now. You can just jump in the shower in the morning. That wasn't happening. You had to go outside and pump the water at the well and heat it up. And so people didn't bathe very often. So I know you don't want to think about that too much, but they washed their hair even less often. So people had not just bad dandruff, they had really serious scalp infections, open sores. And Sarah Breedlove was one of those women. She was losing her hair as a result of that. Her brothers were barbers. She learned something from them about barbering. For a while, she sold products for a woman named Annie Malone, who had founded the Poro Company. Annie Malone would become her competitor, but she learned something from her. And then she moved from St. Louis to Denver in 1905, and she was selling Malone's products, but she was also working for a pharmacist, a man who had the largest pharmacy west of the Mississippi River. And he told her, well, this thing that you're selling, there are a lot of other things already on the market that are like it. It's a really basic formula. It's essentially Vaseline with some kind of medicinal agent. And he told her, you can mix up your own products. And so she began to experiment. Her good friend Charles Joseph Walker, C.J. Walker, who was a newspaper man in St. Louis, moved to Denver. They got married, and she began to call herself Madam C.J. Walker. A bit of an affectation. France was the center of culture and fashion, but she wanted to make sure that people weren't going to call her by her first name. It was at a time when Black women were really disrespected. And if somebody wanted to insult you, they'd call you Aunt Sally or Missy. She was like, I'm having none of this. I am Madam. She really wanted to make sure that people respected her. So she develops this product, her wonderful hair grower and her shampoo. She begins to sell it. She begins to train women. She and her husband travel throughout the South and the southeastern and southwestern United States, and then they settle briefly in Pittsburgh. So this is by 1910. They've been in Pittsburgh, and in 1910, they moved to Indianapolis. That's the city where I grew up. And you can see she has come a long way from that cabin. She has now trained hundreds of women. She's at the wheel of her Model T in front of her house, her $10,000 house, which was a lot of money at the time. And she is beginning to become more involved in political activities and civic activities. And by 1917, Sarah Breedlove has her first convention of her sales agents. It had to have been one of the first conventions of women, businesswomen, women entrepreneurs in America. And at that convention, she gave prizes not just to the women who sold the most products, but to the women who had given the most to charity. So before Mary Kay was born, Madam Walker was giving prizes. She told them in her keynote speech, I want you to understand that as Walker agents, your first duty is to humanity. I want others to look at us and realize that we care not just about ourselves, but about others. And at the end of the convention, the women sent a telegram to President Woodrow Wilson urging him to support legislation to make lynching a federal crime. So Madam Walker was turning this money that she made and this army of sales agents into a political force, into an economic force, making a difference in their communities. So much, like most parents, much of what she was doing was to make her daughter's life better. So here she and her daughter are 10 years after she founds her company with their chauffeur in front of the house in Indianapolis. And while she has moved from Pittsburgh to Indianapolis in 1910, her daughter Lelia is running the Pittsburgh school. They have a couple of different branches. And Alelia's territory includes New York. And she begins to see around 1912, 1913, that the sales of products in Harlem are eclipsing the sales in Pittsburgh. She has visited New York, she's listened to the music, gone to the theater, and Harlem is a lot more interesting to her than Pittsburgh. And so she persuades her mother that they need to have a presence in Harlem just as it is becoming the Black political and cultural mecca. She persuades her mother that they buy a townhouse on 136th Street. And then they buy a second building right next door, and they hire Vertner Tandy, one of the first licensed black architects in New York. And for those of you who are alphas, he is an alpha jewel, one of the founders of Alpha Phi Alpha. He redesigns this double townhouse. And downstairs is the beauty salon. The beauty school is in the basement. And then they begin to entertain. Alelia Walker hosts a dinner party for her mother in 1914. This is actually Madam Walker in Indianapolis at a party that she's hosted for her daughter. They both love music. Even when they were poor and living in St. Louis, they were surrounded by music. Sarah Breedlove, the washerwoman, had a good enough voice to be in the choir at St. Paul AME Church. The organist for the church was a classically trained operatic tenor. He had performed at the 1893 World's Fair. The German musicians were head of the curriculum for the overall schools in St. Louis. The black schools were segregated, but many of the principals at the black schools were black men who'd gone to Oberlin. And then on the streets, the kids were hearing ragtime for a little while. This is where Scott Joplin got his start. And for a little while, Sarah Breedlove and her daughter lived across the alley from Tom Turpin's Rosebud Cafe, where Scott Joplin was. So they grew up. They even, as I say, even when they were poor, they were surrounded by music. And so by the time they had some money, many of their friends were musicians. So when they had parties, when they had dinners, there was always live music. They wanted to really support these young creatives. So Alelia Walker is now in Harlem in 1913, and because of the exhibit Beauty, I just want to show you just how glamorous she was. So Alelia Walker often is overshadowed by her mother because Madam Walker, of course, is the amazing entrepreneur, the woman who became a millionaire, who employed thousands of women, and it's very hard sometimes to be in the shadow of an iconic parent that people always compared her, and she's trying to figure out her own path, her own way of shining her light. But she was naturally very charismatic. She was tall for women of the time. She was 5'9". Sometimes people described her as being over 6 feet tall, but it was because she would wear a little heel, but always big hats and big turbans. So she would walk into a room, as someone said, she didn't just walk into a room, she swept into a room. Another society columnist said people were drawn to her by like bees to flowers. And then another said when she would have a party, everybody wanted to come to her parties because she had beautiful homes and always great food and great entertainment and really interesting friends. And someone said, you'd never turn down an invitation to a party at Alelia Walker. She is the great Black Empress. They described her royal with royal instincts. And another person said when she was having a party, she'd get on the phone and she'd say, "Darling, I'm having a party tonight, and it wouldn't be the same without you. Absolutely not." So we all have friends like that who can say, "Would like just come to the party. I'm putting it together." We all know somebody who has that kind of charisma, and that's who she was. Even as Madam Walker's daughter, when other people were saying, "Well, you're not as good a businesswoman as your mother," but she had her own talents, her own skills. Just another, because of the beauty exhibit, I put some extra pictures just to show you how stylish she was. And this is her hairstyle. Of course, as Madam Walker's daughter, her hair had to be perfect, which is why she wore turbans a lot of times, because it is impossible to have perfect hair every day. And then this is Madam Walker. Again, I wanted to show you sort of her transformation. And you can see this is really just a few years after she started her business, but already she also has charisma, but she has modeled herself in many ways after some of the more educated women in her church, after the school teachers, after some of the women who were part of the club movement, the National Association of Colored Women. So Madam Walker is in Indianapolis, where the company is headquartered, but her daughter persuades her to move to her personal residence to New York. Madam Walker's health is really starting to suffer. She had hypertension at a time when we didn't really know the medicines and the diet, the kinds of things that we now know control hypertension. And her daughter wanted her closer by, so she's persuaded her to move her personal residence to New York. And Madam Walker, I have lots and lots of letters between Madam Walker and her attorney. And in one of the letters, she essentially says to her attorney, that house is nice on 136th Street, but it's not big enough for two women. And so she wanted her own house. And so she hired Vertner Tandy to design Villa Lawaro, her home in Irvington, New York, just outside of New York. And it was called Villa Lawaro because both women loved opera. And sometimes people think, oh, and this is what I thought, oh, they got wealthy, and so they would go to the opera. But really, opera was the people's music. There were a lot of black opera singers. It was a popular music. It wasn't something for snooty people. And some of their friends were opera singers, and one of their friends was Enrico Caruso, the famous Italian opera singer, and he visited the house when it was under construction, and he said it reminded him of homes in Italy, and he suggested the name Villa and then Le Waro, Lewaro, using letters from Lelia Walker and then Robinson, who was her first husband. This is the music room in all of their houses. They had musical instruments because their friends who were musicians would perform. When Madam Walker died in 1919, Alelia Walker became president of the company. Here she is with the executive team that Madam Walker had assembled. And one of the reasons, I think there are reasons why Madam Walker is more remembered than some of her contemporaries who were in the beauty business, in part because her daughter persuaded her to move to New York, which was the media capital and the entertainment capital of the world. And so she was being written about in national publications. But it was also because she was very smart about her executive team. Her attorney, the manager of her factory was a woman who'd been dean of girls at a black boarding school. She knew how to bring people together who would empower others and who could bring out leadership in others. This is just another picture from one of the conventions. So there's a longer story that we may talk about in Q&A, but right before Madam Walker died, Alelia Walker had two boyfriends, both doctors, both handsome. One was a bad boy, and one was a good guy. Her mother liked the good guy. Sometimes people say the bad one. I'm like, really? Whose mother do you know? But maybe for herself. But her mother liked the good guy. She was more attracted to the bad boy. And one of them broke her heart. So we can talk about that later, or it's in the book. But so, in order to heal herself, she took a first class trip to Paris. She was first class on this SS Paris ocean liner. She stayed on the Champs Elysees in a first class hotel. She was invited to Cartier to view jewelry because she loved diamonds and pearls. She then went from there to Monte Carlo, to Nice, to Rome, um, and then to Cairo, where she visited the pyramids. And then, so I'm going to go back so I can talk about this. And then from there, she went to Palestine, then Djibouti, and then she took a train to Addis Ababa, where she met the Ethiopian empress, and then came back through London. So 1924, so that's 1921, 22, 1924. This is my grandmother in the center. This is a longer story that I'm going to try to make short. But my grandmother May had very long braids, and Madam Walker's main product was Madam Walker's Wonderful Hair Grower, of course. May was adopted by Alelia Walker. When Madam Walker and then still Sarah Breedlove and her daughter were living in St. Louis, one of their church members was a man named Elijah Hammond, who was a businessman and a school teacher. And when Madam Walker arrived in Indianapolis, his mother lived across the street from her. And she also was a member of St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church. And they became close. She was about the same age as Madam Walker's mother would have been. And as she became close to the family, she also met one of Elijah's sisters, the daughter of the woman who lived across the street from her, a woman named Sarah Etta Hammond. And Sarah Etta Hammond was the third generation of women in her family to be widowed in her 30s with 8 children. One of those children was my grandmother. But Madam Walker would invited May, my grandmother, to be a model for Walker hair products. And she became close to her, and eventually her daughter, Alelia Walker, adopted my grandmother. So my grandmother has kind of a Cinderella story. And, Cinderella's story is not always does not have a happy ending all the time. But Amelia Walker made her marry someone she did not want to marry. And this is my grandmother at that first wedding, not my grandfather. So I don't know that my grandfather was perfect, but this is the wedding picture, and this is made with her with the groomsmen. So that I talk about that a lot in the book. It's an interesting twist on the story. This is just because we're talking about fashion. This is detail from the wedding dress. It was designed by a black designer. In 1924, there was a convention, another convention of Walker sales agents in New York. This time they were at Villa Lawaro. I just love this picture. For me, this is kind of an iconic picture of Black excellence. Women who would have been sharecroppers and maids and laundresses now had their own businesses. And they were able to travel to New York to visit Madam Walker's home. So a house like this, many of them would have been cleaning that house. Instead, they were able to sit down, put their feet up, enjoy themselves. And that Madam Walker intentionally built the house for that purpose. She said to inspire Black boys and girls so they could see what could be accomplished. Amelia Walker was a key part of the Harlem Renaissance. So after Madam Walker died, she's still running the New York business, the New York office. The business in Indianapolis is really being operated by Madam Walker's executive team. And Amelia Walker is trying to find her own light, trying to find the thing that is her passion. And she becomes very much a patron of the arts. She turns one floor of the townhouse on 136th Street in what came to be known as the Dark Tower. It was a cultural salon where the artists and writers and musicians and actors of the time could gather, could entertain, could meet patrons. She had a meeting in the summer of 1927 with young writers like Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen, and they came up with this idea for this very comfortable place where they would come and the young writers would pay $1 a year membership, and then they were supposed to go out to solicit patrons, people who would endow the operation, so that the young writers could basically eat for free while other people subsidized it. And it was a great concept. It was really kind of ahead of its time. This is the invitation to the Dark Tower. We dedicate this tower to the aesthetes, that cultural group of young Negro writers, sculptors, painters, music artists, composers, and their friends, a quiet place of particular charm, a rendezvous where they may feel at home to partake of a little tidbit and pleasant, interesting atmosphere. This is the menu from the Dark Tower. My favorite item on the menu is Amelia Walker iced tea. It was prohibition, so that meant you weren't supposed to have anything alcoholic, but I don't know what they might have put in there or what people might have brought. These are some of the books that were in my house when I was growing up. First editions of Langston Hughes's The Weary Blues, Countee Cullen's Color, James Weldon Johnson's The Book of American Negro Portrait, another Florida person, James Weldon Johnson. And people like Zora Neale Hurston and Florence Mills, who's a name you know Zora Neale Hurston's name. She's another Florida person. But Florence Mills is a name you may not know, but she was the singer of the era, died very young, and there are no recordings of her, but you can Google Florence Mills. Somebody might want to write a paper about her. Alberta Hunter, who was a famous blues singer, Jimmy Daniels. These are people I interviewed in the early 1980s when I was doing my research. Paul Robeson, I know you know that name, Paul Robeson, who was the famous actor, and his wife, Eslanda. And then again, just because we're talking about fashion, Amelia Walker and her riding habits. She was in Hot Springs, Arkansas. She loved riding horses, and she was always stylishly dressed. And this is Amelia with her friends, and they were, the black swells. These were folks who dressed well, ate well, enjoyed themselves. And then Amelia Walker in the music room at Villa Lawaro. I just had to put this on because it's fashion. The list of her furs that were in storage at Wanamaker's. And then at another Villa Lawaro shop. This particular coat is right now on, this says the Museum of the City of New York exhibition. It was there many, many years ago, but there's a new exhibit that's just opened in New York at the New York Historical on queer Harlem Renaissance. And there's a little section on Amelia Walker. Her places, her homes were welcoming equally to her straight and gay friends. And so I lent them some of the items from my collection because I wanted to show that this place, the Dark Tower, was a welcoming space. Again, because we're doing beauty, this is some of her jewelry, another necklace, and this necklace is she's wearing in this photograph that was taken by Bernice Abbott, who was a very famous photographer of the era. A'Lelia Walker was a muse for artists. This is a portrait by Richmond Barté and a bust by Roy Shelton. And then when A'Lelia Walker died in August of 1931, thousands of people lined up. And she was, as Langston Hughes said, the joy goddess of Harlem's 1920s. He wrote a poem about her and called her Queen of the Night. And so while she's often compared to her mother and not being the businesswoman that her mother was, not founding a company, in her own way, she was bringing joy to people. In her own way, she was helping people discover their creativity. And so I'm really always happy to share the story of A'Lelia Walker and Madam Walker. Thank you.
Bundles another round.
All right, y'all, I'm a shorty, okay?
I'm going to ask that anyone with a note card go ahead and start generating your questions for Ms. Bundles. We learned a lot just in about 30 minutes or so. So you all might have some responses, some additional thoughts and questions. I encourage you to write them on your cards and pass them toward the front where you see the stack of books. In the meantime, I have my own questions.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.
And
of
thank
course.
you to the deans and the professors, and thank you all very much.
Of course. So I want to start here. One of the things, there are so many fascinating components to the book. One of the things that I appreciate most is how rich the text is. Rich in two ways, rich in detail, but also rich in wealth. Okay, everything is shiny. She is referencing chandeliers. She is referencing sequins and monogrammed napkins and having property next to the famed jeweler Charles Tiffany. Like that's next level kind of wealth, right? So one of the questions that came to mind as I was listening to the book was your thoughts around wealth right now, especially in a moment where there is significant critique, right, about folks like Elon Musk, who makes more than all elementary teachers in the United States combined. Combined. What are your thoughts about wealth right now?
You know, I think some people have lost their way. It really is just about putting more money in there. It's not even their bank accounts because they're not even dealing with bank accounts. It's the power, and that is the tradition of philanthropy in America. In some ways, was the tradition of the robber barons who got a conscience. Carnegie Library, which is here, the Rockefellers, but they at least were trying to be philanthropists. I mean, I think now there are some people who there's not even a conscience anymore. But fortunately, that's not everybody. There are people like the Kinseys who have prospered and who understand that, as Madam Walker did, that when you have been blessed with that kind of wealth, it is important to give back. You know, I think the universe writes itself in some ways because it's not sustainable. But yeah, there's some people with no conscience.
Thank you for that. Appreciate that. One of my big gripes with the way Black history specifically is often told is the way in which it's compressed, right? And you mentioned not only is it incorrect that Madam Walker invented the hot comb, right? But she's really sort of drilled down into almost nothing. And we see that a lot with our legends specifically, right? She sat on the back of the bus. He did something with peanuts. Somebody else did something with the sweet potato. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And their stories are so much more expansive than the sort of fun fact that
Right.
we assign them. Again, one of the pieces in your book that you discuss is Madam Walker and Alelia's commitment to activism. And specifically during World War II, they are anti lynching
Hmm.
activists. They are voting rights champions. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I think when I was growing up, my mother was vice president of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company, so I knew my mom went to work there. I would watch the ladies mix up the products, but I knew kind of what everybody else knew. Madam Walker founded a hair care company, but in the course of my research over these many years, I really began to understand these dimensions of her, and I was not all that interested in the hair care part. Though it is important for me that she created jobs, but when I began to understand that she used that money as a philanthropist, as a political activist, that made me much more interested in her. When I discovered that she was very outspoken on behalf of the Black soldiers during World War One, and in fact was spied upon by a Black spy who was working for the War Department and called a Negro subversive. She and Ida B. Wells. So that made me say, oh, there is something else going on here. This is a woman who understands the assignment, in a sense, of what she needs to be doing for Black folks. She was very much in favor of women's right to vote, though the 19th Amendment was not enacted until after she had died, but she was advocating for that. She realized that women, while they cared about their hair, they wanted some hair care products that worked for them. That what she learned as she was training these sales agents, as she was traveling all over the United States, the Caribbean, and Central America, is that yes, they wanted that cosmetic thing of versatility for hair care, but what they really needed and wanted was education and economic independence. And that's why she was rewarding them during those conventions. That's why she was encouraging them to buy property. But both women cared about politics. I would say with Alelia Walker during World War One, both of the people, because they had more money than the average person, people would come to them for contributions. Can you give to this cause? Can you give to that cause? And at that point, the 300,000 Black men went to Europe during World War One. So I don't know how many of you studied anything about World War One. It's a very interesting period in terms of African American rights because we have the NAACP has been founded, the Urban League, a lot of other organizations where we are asserting our rights, but there's a lot of pushback to that. And there were some Black leaders who thought, well, if we enlist in the Army, they will have to give us our full citizenship. They'll have to treat us like, full citizens. So Madam Walker was one of those people who believed, that that was possible. And when people were coming to her for money, there were a lot of women's organizations, and they were doing good things. They were knitting socks and raising money to buy razors, shaving razors, and cigarettes, those kinds of things. But Alelia Walker decided that she was going to do something big. And she rented out a big casino, a big hall in Harlem to raise money to buy an ambulance for the Black soldiers. So this was like in the tradition of her mother, she wanted to make a big splash. And she invited Enrico Caruso to be the celebrity, the cameo celebrity to be the draw. They sold the place out and they were able to buy this ambulance. So that kind of activism was important. And then Madam Walker became very involved with the NAACP's anti-lynching movement. After some of you may, you know about the Tulsa massacre of 1921. In 1917 was the East St. Louis massacre. And Madam Walker, because they lived in St. Louis, knew this neighborhood well. And there was something called the Silent Protest Parade. The NAACP organized a parade on Fifth Avenue in New York. 5,000 African Americans marched silently up Fifth Avenue to protest this massacre. And Madam Walker, after that, gave $5,000 to the NAACP's anti-lynching fund. So that political piece, for me, it's very important for us to understand that the economic piece and the political piece went together.
I appreciate that. also want to ask you about HBCUs, right? In many ways, the book is about what folks might call Black aristocracy,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're talking lawyers, doctors, very much so connected individuals. Um, you mentioned Meharry in
Mm-hmm.
the book. You mentioned Howard University, Morehouse, of
Mm-hmm.
course, Spelman in your own family. Can you talk about HBCUs now
Mm-hmm.
and their function as equalizers in
Mm-hmm.
society?
Well, yes, definitely HBCUs. I mean, Amelia Walker was always at the Howard Lincoln game. So that you all have the classic that's happening. That was the classic then. It was every Thanksgiving, Howard and Lincoln would play. They would either play in Washington, D.C. for Howard, or they would play in Philadelphia because it was near Lincoln. So that was key for her to be a part of that. Alelia Walker went to Knoxville College, but really just for about a semester. She didn't really last long there. She'd had some sort of setbacks in high school, and she wasn't really ready for the curriculum, but she at least had gone. Um, my grandfather, my great grandfather went to Lincoln University and was valedictorian of his class in 1883. My grandfather and his brother went to Lincoln. My uncle went to Lincoln. So they were a key part of that tradition. My mother went to Howard University. So historically, black colleges
And
are
did
real.
she pledge? I feel like
She was an AKA.
that's what I thought.
Yeah. So I
Everybody
don't.
can't be perfect.
Yeah. But she had lots of Delta friends.
Okay.
And we were talking about this earlier with the campus queens. I have a photo of my mother in the Howard Homecoming Parade in a car that says, I think it says Scrollers on the side. She was in the court, the Kappa court. So.
Okay. Okay.
And my father was a Kappa, so he said AKAs meant after Kappas always. That was his joke about that.
Okay.
Is that true? So HBCUs were clearly very important, and one of the things that Alelia Walker did in terms of fraternities and sororities, there was the Walker Building in Indianapolis, which is now a national historic landmark. They opened in the December of 1927, and for December 1928, Alelia Walker invited the leadership of what would become the Divine Nine to have an event there, and it was before there was really a Pan-Hellenic organization, but she recognized the power
Mm.
of the fraternities and sororities,
Mhm.
and many of them had their parties at that building, that Harlem building. But HBCUs, most of her friends who were educated had gone to HBCUs.
Mhm. What about now? How do you think these institutions contribute as equalizers now? What is our role for today?
Just when I look at you today, I know that you all are leading. And there's just no question about it. We are in a moment, without me going into too much detail, where some doors that we thought were open are no longer open, and you are able to fortify yourselves here. You are able to get the encouragement that you need here, and you are able also to encourage others. And that may be the most important thing that you do while you are here, because you'll be out in the world, and I did not go to an HBCU, and I went out into the world, and everybody didn't love me. Um, but you'll go out into the world, and you know who loves you.
Thank you for that. There's another interview of you that I watched maybe last week where you had to put some folks in their place about the Netflix biography of
Mm-hmm.
Madam Walker, Self Made. I don't know how many of you all have seen that. And we talked earlier about so many of the indiscrepancies and
Mm-hmm.
just fallacies that Netflix put forward in that production. Can you talk about, number one, why you think some
Mm-hmm.
of that may have been necessary from their perspective? And number two, can you talk to students now about the trouble with AI, the
Mm-hmm.
necessity of critical thought, so that you can tell the difference between faction, fact and
Yeah,
fiction.
and faction is the right.
Yeah, right,
It's the right. It's
right.
the right word.
Remix.
It's the right. All right. So I'm going to do part one and then remind me about the AI part. So I think that the way history is taught in most places, it's boring for people when you're in high school. How many of you loved history in high school? Like, okay, oh, good. That's more than thank you. I did not love it in high school because my high school history textbook a long time ago said that slaves, not enslaved people, as we have come to say, slaves were contented, and it literally said contented because they were clothed and fed and therefore better off than free people. Now, I knew that was not true in my bones, but I didn't have the language to dispute that. So I did not learn to love history until I started teaching myself. Fortunately, my grandfather had given me some, history about his family that gave me a little bit of kernel, but I really had to teach myself. And now you all know more, but I think it's still not that interesting for most people in high school. And so then we grow up not knowing the details of our history. And so when we see something like Self-Made, the Netflix series, because that's interesting, it's entertaining. Octavia Spencer is great. And we think that it's true. But these TV shows that are not documentaries. Documentaries are nonfiction. Documentaries, you can usually pretty much think that somebody's done the research and those things are factual. But something that's entertainment is not history. And so I now find myself with this very entertaining Netflix series, Self-Made, having to actually tell people, no, that really didn't happen. So here's what I have said to people. Octavia Spencer was great. My book, On Her Own Ground, was the inspiration. I was really excited that Octavia Spencer was the actor signed to do this. And I was hoping for Hidden Figures, and I feel like I got Real Housewives of Atlanta.
Ooh.
And that was the showrunners. The showrunners, that's the person who manages the overall production, and the head writer, who all happen to be Black women, so I cannot blame this on somebody else, thought that having two Black women fighting each other would be entertaining to the audience. They thought that's what Hollywood tells you. Let's have a cliche. And then they added in the conflict that it was over skin color between Madam Walker and her competitor, Annie Malone. Their conflict was not skin color. They were both businesswomen. They weren't friends, but that wasn't the source of their conflict. And then they just made up other stuff. Amelia Walker did not have a girlfriend, but they just entirely pulled that out of thin air. But I would say there were a couple of other things, and they knew. I mean, we had lots of conversations, and they knew what my objections were. But there were some other things that I thought were much more subtle, but how we pervert our history. One of them was this: they decided that they wanted to bring John D. Rockefeller in, I guess, to show that Madam Walker lived not that far from Rockefeller, that they had mansions not that far apart. And so they made up this scene where Madam Walker is having some conflict with some of her agents. They want to do one thing, she wants to do something else. That part actually happened, but what they did was to say, oh, so she goes over to John D. Rockefeller's home on the lawn while he's playing croquet and ask him for advice. Madam Walker did not need to ask John D. Rockefeller for advice. She was friends with Mary McLeod Bethune,
Come on.
with W.E.B. Du Bois, with Booker T. Washington, with James Weldon Johnson, with Mary Church Terrell, a name you may not know, Ida B. Wells. That was her posse. And so I thought, why are you doing this? Just perpetuates a stereotype that we don't have these ideas ourselves. And then there was another scene. Madam Walker's attorney, F.B. Ransom, was a straight arrow, crossed the T's, dotted the I's. It allowed her to be the visionary because he was making sure everything was buttoned down at home in Indianapolis in the factory. So she could travel and she could meet people and she could develop the business and expand the business. And he had taken a vow at 12 years old as a Boy Scout to never drink, smoke, or gamble. Now, that's what you want in an attorney. You want somebody who's a straight arrow. But in the Netflix series, they made up a character. Bill Bellamy is a funny guy. Now, this is no shade on him. He played this character called Sweetness, who was supposed to be Mr. Ransom's cousin. So he was not just a numbers runner; he was a pimp. So, like, really, this is this is what we're reducing people to. So it was that kind of thing. But I think we get sucked in because we so want to see ourselves on screen.
Mm,
We
mm,
so want to see ourselves win
mm.
that we don't critique things. Now that brings us to AI.
In the
Lord.
age of AI,
Mm-hmm.
in the age of what I would say is information overload, we're all scrolling all day long.
Mm-hmm.
How do you develop critical thinking skills, and how do you distinguish between what is real and what is not?
It's very hard. I don't know. I'm on Instagram. You all are on Instagram. Maybe you've moved beyond Instagram, but I mean, I'm on Instagram going through the scrolling, and there are things that I'm like. There's a lot of information, and I saw something the other day, and I said to a friend, "This isn't this interesting?" And they're like, "Are you sure that's not AI?" And I'm like, "Wow." And I think I'm pretty smart. I think I have a pretty critical eye. And I had to then ask myself, is this AI? Every day I'm seeing stuff like somebody has made an AI generated, this is who Madam Walker is. And it has nothing to do with her. I saw something the other day about a friend of mine who is a African American CEO of a major company who invest in black businesses, and this was a story supposedly about him, and the person was white. I'm like, what? Well, but we have to be so careful when we see these things. What is the source? Do not take things for granted and definitely don't pass them on. But the other part of AI that is, as a person like me who's a writer, who really prides myself on creating the right words and the right sentences and crafting. Writing a book is my book is, I don't know however many pages it is, but it was twice as long when I sent it to my editor. And every sentence is probably at least a day's worth of research. And then you distill it down and you want the rhythm to be right. It's like writing poetry. You want to make sure that you have the right word. Well, now, there are people who just write their papers with Chat GPT.
And they all sound alike.
And they
And
all
they
sound
forget to
alike.
take the bold off certain sentences.
Right. So what I think, what I've noticed, because I use Chat GPT, if I just like need a fact, or I need, I want to answer something quickly. So it's a tool,
Mhm.
but the key is not to let it tool you. So if I know something about a topic and I ask Chat GPT, if I really know the topic, I can immediately find the errors, but that's because I know the topic. And so you have to be really careful. And I will say one of the things, because I'm not grading papers, and you all are writing papers and handing them in and maybe trying to cut corners a little bit. But I do judge a couple of competitions every year. Some young people who are applying for fellowships in chemistry, Madam Walker fellowships. And last year, in those 30 or 40 applications, and one of the questions is, tell us how your life is parallel to Madam Walker's, or why does Madam Walker inspire you? And I know they were Chat GPT. It was almost the same thing
Mhm.
for every answer. It was the sentence structure. So you may be able to fool somebody, but ultimately you don't want to fool yourself, because if you're not taking that time to really think about what's being handed in and what you're writing, then you're cheating yourself without that thought process. The thinking through, the critiquing, it really is important. And again, you can cut a corner today, but 10 years from now, when you really didn't do that thinking, when you had the opportunity in college, it will catch up with you. Now, I know that may sound, maybe it won't, but it will.
Mhm. I'm going to turn it over to our students and our faculty. If you all have any questions, please forward them and share while we have such a grand opportunity in front of us.
Let me say how thrilled I am to see a full house, because I know you all are thinking about the classic.
And these are our scholars. These are our scholars. They're thinking about
But
you,
thank
thinking
you.
about this text. Dr. Young.
Thank you.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's an interesting question. One of the things that, as I, really drilled down on Amelia Walker's life, is that she was really a young adult by the time her mother began to have substantial wealth, and so she didn't grow up in the same way that Mary Church Terrell had grown up, and she experienced that sort of the discrimination. But she also was insulated from it because she had the homes, because when she traveled, everybody knew Madam Walker. So if they were traveling, the porters and the red caps would make sure that they had some comfort. They would see her coming, and it was Madam Walker and some of the accomplished musicians, and those were the black people with status who were traveling, so they would insulate them. And so she was insulated from it, but she, you never really escape the racism and the prejudice. When she was, yes, she was in first class on the ocean liner to Paris, and she made friends with some of the Europeans who were there. But she had an incident where one of the Vanderbilts was on the trip and he talked to a French reporter and he was very denigrating to her. He described her as a negress and he was very insulting, and that turned up in a French newspaper. She wrote a letter to the editor, but it was never far off stage. I think you just have to speak right into it. Hold it right up to your mouth.
I'm speaking. Oh, okay, it turned on. Okay. Good evening, Ms. Bundles. I just want to say it's a pleasure to have you here on our campus today. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Briefly, you touched on like your disdain with Netflix and how you didn't really appreciate how they portrayed your great grandmother and the, I guess, ongoing narrative of a conflict there. But I just wanted to ask you also, my name is Johnny Schmiller. I'm a second year pre medicine biology scholar from Brooklyn, New York. Um, but my question to you is, what mindset or traits would you say that you were embedded
Mm.
while you were continuing to, I guess, view the biography on
I'm sorry.
Netflix?
Can you hold the microphone
Oh yes, I
steady? Okay. You said
apologize.
what traits? What?
What mindset or traits did you have you embedded while in your journey to not only have, sorry, not only being like appealing the disdain of the cinematic writers, but to also express like how you graciously equipped those traits without like basically painting the narrative of being a complaining black woman, just expressing, yeah,
How am I doing this without being the complaining black woman?
yes, without,
I am the complaining black woman, and I
me
don't
too,
mind that. But
absolutely.
this is I have a really good friend who is sometimes coaches me. She's a really wise woman, and when I knew that I was getting ready to just have to speak publicly about
Mm.
the Netflix series, she came to a couple of events, and what she said to me is, understand what your intention is. My intention is not to um, be negative. And that's why I always start with Octavia Spencer was great. Octavia Spencer understood the assignment. Every time she came on screen, I felt that Madam Walker was there, Madam Walker's presence, because she understood the importance of Madam Walker. But she was dealing with the script that had been given to her. And at that point, it was everything had been approved by the studios. There were people who worked really hard on that. The makeup people, the hair stylists, the costume designers, the set people, um, the actors who were there. Blair Underwood is a really nice man, even though he plays a villain in the film. Other people who worked so hard, and so I really do want to give props to those people, and I try to make sure that I do that. My objection was perverting the key story. And I just think I have to speak up on that. And I have had people say to me, oh, well, it's Hollywood. Everybody understands it's Hollywood. At least more people know Madam Walker's name. But I don't think everybody understands it's just Hollywood because people think it's true. But the other thing that I have thought more recently, when people say that to me, I'm like, yeah, that is true. More people know Madam Walker's name. And it makes some people more curious. It makes some people really want to dig more deeply. But it's sort of like telling somebody who's in a really bad marriage that they have a nice house and they have a nice car and they just ought to put up with it. And I just don't think we need to settle. So that's where I'm coming from. Mm-hmm.
Greetings. I am Jasmine Brown, a second-year pre-nursing scholar hailing from Atlanta, Georgia. And today my question is, I know that you touched on a lot of teaching your own history and that critical thinking is beneficial in college. So my question would be, what do you think the newer generation can do to spread the legacy of Black history moving forward?
Yeah, you all have a lot of work to do. But I think that we're complaining, and rightly so, that there are some places where the curriculum is being changed and where our stories are being erased and where the lies are being told. I mean, that's happening. But I don't think we've ever fully been able to rely on schools and classrooms to be our teachers. That we have to take that upon ourselves. And you can't erase our history. It's on TikTok, it's on Instagram, it's on social media, but it's also in the library, but it's also in our families.
That's right.
And so because I'm really fortunate, you saw those documents and photographs and those things I have because my grandparents saved those things and they knew the importance of it. And I'm the keeper of those things, and I'm preserve them, and I've benefited from the archives in so many places like the archives here. But I know that I have lots of friends who, a family member dies and they have to clean out the house and they're like, oh my God, just throw grandma's stuff out because I don't feel like dealing with it. But I am always the person I'm sort of the last man standing in my family, but every house with every death, I'm the one who cleans it out. And I go through everything. Because in the middle of some random pile of papers is a birth certificate. And if we do not take it upon ourselves to preserve our family history, we are participating in the erasure. So we have to do that. That is where we start. And it is, if it's, when you talk to your grandparents, ask them a question about their childhood. Sometimes they will tell you things that they won't tell your parents. Be the one who does your family history because you will discover stories and strength that you did not know about. And sometimes you will hear some things that are uncomfortable, or you might hear some family secrets. Those are part of the story too. But I think that it starts with family, but it also starts with self-education. Read as much as you can. When I first started doing the research for this book, for these books, it was really a professor of mine at Columbia when I was in journalism school, and when we were trying to figure out my master's paper topic. So I know those of you who are professors and those of you who are students, you've had those conversations where like, what do you want to write about? What's the topic? And I, as a graduate student, gave some really lame topics. And my professor listened patiently. And at the end of the conversation, she said, "Your name is Alelia. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker and Alelia Walker?" And I was not walking around talking about that. I was like, I'm trying to be me. I'm like, why does anybody care about that? And she looked at me, Phil Garland, the only Black woman on the faculty. And this is the mid 70s when there were the only Black person on the faculty kind of thing happening. And she looked at me and she said, "That's what you're going to write about. You're going to write about your family." And if I had not had Phyllis Garland as my professor, I might have gotten around to writing about this, but she validated that for me. But when I started doing this, there were very few books being published by or about Black women. Not that they weren't being written, but very few biographies. Now I have a whole wall in my office of biographies that are Harlem Renaissance people, Harlem Renaissance adjacent. But that scholarship has happened in the last 50 years. And so we cannot let that scholarship be forgotten, and we have to build upon it. So thank you for asking.
Thank you.
I know my answers are long, but I just feel like there's so much I want to pour into you all because I just know that you're going to make such a difference.
And we appreciate that. And I would just humbly add that if you're looking for a place to start, it doesn't matter what your major is. There's nothing preventing you from taking a course in the Department of History. I was a journalism major while I was at FAMU, and I began to take history courses, and it changed the trajectory of my life. And so, if you're in pharmacy, that doesn't keep you from coming into Tucker Hall on the 4th floor and speaking with one of us and taking one of those classes that might change your life as well. I have what I think is a really
Okay.
Hi, I'm sorry. Thank you
Hi.
for joining us this evening. Hello.
Thank you.
I am Kyra Antoine, a 4th year political science major, minoring in business administration from Houston, Texas. And I just wanted to reach out as far as being kind of a descendant from somebody who was actively involved in the civil rights movement. My great grandmother, she was born in 1924 in Texas, of course. And so she was a sharecropper for most of her life. That was before Brown versus Board was passed, and she was able to attend nicer schools, more, the equal schools and integrated schools. And I just wanted to reach out to you as far as how does it feel to reflect on being so close to such a historic figure, reflecting on her journey and how it sits with you, and just in general talking about the history of what it means to be Black in America and kind of processing that and making it something that is more empowering, because I do find myself a lot of the times feeling very mispleased, obviously, and just disappointed in the way that African Americans have been treated in this country since its beginning.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. I'm 73 years old, and that means that I am a person who. Thank you. But I benefited from Brown versus Board of Education, 1954 and 55. I was a toddler. I benefited from the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s. I benefited from affirmative action which was women, the doors were opening up. When I graduated from college in 1974, women still had to have their fathers or husbands sign for their credit cards. I became a producer at NBC News because women had sued the networks and had sued the magazines, the news magazines, because young women would be hired as secretaries and researchers, and young men would be hired as desk assistants, an entry-level job, and assistant producers. And 10 years later, the young women would still be researchers and secretaries, and the young men would be senior producers and executive producers. So I have seen, I have watched that pendulum swing where the doors are opening up, where more women are in professional schools, where more African Americans are in leadership positions. And right now, I feel that a lot of those doors are closing. That some people, that the success of these last few decades has been offensive to some people, has created resentment. But I think that our ancestors have always been dealing with this. And I think maybe my generation thought, well, those doors opened up, they're going to stay opened up. Our children and our grandchildren are going to be able to keep just moving forward. But the backlash seems to always come. But we don't stop. It doesn't stop our creativity. It doesn't stop our intelligence. It doesn't stop our ability to get an education and start businesses and make a difference in the world. And so it is distressing, as you say, depressing, but sometimes it's fortifying and just gives us a little bit more motivation. So that's all kind of abstract in a way, but I just encourage you to take that strength from your grandmother and from all the other ancestors and just put it to work.
Thank you so much. Can you all give her another round?
Thank you. One more?
Dean Matthews is encouraging me to give
Yes.
one more student
All
the
right.
floor. In the essence of time, the reason that I want to be mindful of the hour is because we do have a few, not many, but we do have a few books for those of you all who are interested in getting a copy signed. And so I just want to create time and space for that as well. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you.
Greetings. I'm
Hi.
Todd Foley, hailing from Crestview, Florida, an electrical engineer. Why do you think Annie Malone's contributions are overlooked in mainstream history?
That's a good question. Why are Annie Malone's contributions overlooked? So Annie Malone was Madam Walker's real life competitor. Madam Walker sold her products for a while. They fell out, and they were both really significant businesswomen. And I've written about that. I did some of the original research that uncovered that, and so I always try to give Annie Malone credit. There's an exhibit at the Peoria Riverfront Museum in Peoria, Illinois. She's from Illinois, with Annie Malone, and I went there and did a lecture. So I always try to tell the story honestly. But there are some things that have been written, some things that have been made up, because there's kind of this posthumous competition between the two women. Who was the first millionaire? Neither of them was necessarily the first, though we have documents that show Madam Walker. But to your question, why do I think Annie Malone is not as well known? Part of it is what I was saying about Madam Walker's choice of executives. Her executive team, her C-suite, was stellar. And they kept records, meticulous records, her attorney, down to the penny. So that I do have those documents that show what Madam Walker made every year, the annual reports, the advertising, the newspapers, the letters, literally 40,000 documents have been saved and digitized at the Indiana Historical Society. So we have, in a sense, the receipts to tell the story. I think what happened with Annie Malone is a couple of things. She did not make the same wise choices about her executive team. There was a lawsuit against her around 1913 where she had promised an employee that she would give him a certain percentage of the net fees. She reneged on that and he sued her, and that was an ongoing lawsuit. Then she married a man named Aaron Malone, and Aaron Malone undermined her, and eventually they were divorced, but he had really been sort of psychologically destructive to her. And so then she ended up having to pay him a large sum of money. And so I think there were some missteps that she made in terms of the people who surrounded her. But in the end, both women employed thousands of women, made a difference in the lives of women. But I do have the receipts to show Madam Walker. Two other things. A'Lelia Walker persuading her mother to move to New York, to have a presence in New York, where Annie Malone stayed in St. Louis, and it was at the same time that this husband was undermining her.
Teach me for a moment. Give me some education. when I'm looking at just the marketing
Mm-hmm.
of the Walker Company versus Poro College
Mhm.
and Annie Malone's businesses, Madam Walker's enterprises seem to be, in my mind, marketed with a much more glitzy intention around
Mhm.
it. And again, just as a student of beauty culture, one of my guesses to respond to your question would be that the marketing and the timeline around Madam Walker was just really attractive. I mean, think about her name, Madam Walker. And she also promoted this story of rags to riches, right? Which was really attractive and fascinating given the time in which she existed. So I
No, I
would
think
guess that some
that's
of that,
absolutely
yeah.
right. That it is, it's marketing, and they were very different personalities. Annie Malone and even her employees said she was kind of a more, reticent person. Madam Walker was more charismatic. Madam Walker put her own image on her product. That was revolutionary for a Black woman to put her own picture on her products. That was at a time that the advertisements, the before and after picture that I showed you, that was Madam Walker in the early days of advertising. It's like Jenny Craig commercials. We take those for granted. But at that time, there were white-owned companies that would have a before and after drawing. The before picture was a Black woman whose skin was splotchy, whose hair was sticking out, and the after picture was what was considered the Gibson girl. That was kind of the idealized vision of white women's beauty that even white women couldn't really attain. But they would do that contrast, and Madam Walker is like, no, this is what beauty is. So, and she had people who were doing advertising.
I definitely think Madam Walker's image making intentionality certainly set her. It made her a celebrity
Right.
in a way
And
that
building the house in Irvington. She was in the New York Times in 1917.
And I don't know if you use this word in the book. Maybe you do in the very beginning. The term influencer. Do you use that to describe Alelia?
But she was an influencer.
She absolutely was in terms of the parties, the fashion, and I don't know that Annie Malone had all of that going on.
No, she was
a businesswoman.
She was more nose to the grindstone, sort of understated, and the same products essentially. And neither of them was the first one to come up with that formula. It had been around for centuries, but it was marketing.
Right. Well, again, I thank you very, very much. I want to just close with a few gifts from the Department of History as well as FAMU Center for African and African American Studies. The green bag, Dr. Young, it should be right here. and the flowers. This is just a token of our appreciation that we'd like to present to you. If you are a fan of hip hop, you all are familiar with Andre 3000's declaration, right? That the South got something to say. Y'all have heard that before? I'm going to borrow that phrasing and say that Black women journalists and Black women historians got something to say.
Absolutely.
And I implore all of you to support our work, one, by visiting the exhibit Beyond Black Beauty, if you have not already, and buying one of the umpteen books that Ms. Bundles has written, and to fall in love with history as a gift to yourself. So thank you all and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much.